Noted. Welcome to the MDPCP Advisory Council Track 3 Recommendations Advisory Council discussion tonight. As normal, we start with a roll. I'll call the names of the people who I can see, the council members. If I've missed you during the announcement, if you could confirm for us that you're here, that would be great. I have Doctors Barr, Berenson, I believe I saw. I have Reedman, Rose, Haft, and Okiki. For council members, I have Bob Atlas. I have Kevin Hayes, and I believe that's all I've seen. If there are other council members on the line or virtually, please announce yourself for us at this time.
Hey, this is I had to call in.
Okay, so I have Gene and Patrick Dooley. Anyone else? Okay, so let me turn it back to Melanie for a few operational announcements, and then we'll get started.
Good evening, everyone. As usual, the meeting is being recorded. So please contact Annette or Melanie or send a chat message if you're having any technical issues. You can mute and unmute yourself using the small button at the bottom of the screen that looks like a microphone. Please remain on mute when you're not speaking to reduce the background noise. Staff may mute you if there's a lot of background noise coming from your line, but you can always unmute yourself. You can use the chat function to send notes to all attendees. However, you cannot send it to a specific attendee using this technology. Please announce yourself when speaking. And since there are a lot of people in the meeting, we'd like to sequence people when possible. So we understand there's times when people just want to respond, and that's fine. But please signal the team if you'd like to speak. One method is taking a sheet of paper, folding it in half, and holding it up. The meeting facilitator will call on you, or he may randomly call on people to get a broader range of perspective. The last thing we want to say is that please be aware of the position of your camera if you're on video, and be sure that you're holding your paper where it can be seen on the video and not over here, because I'm actually holding it up, but of course you cannot see it because it's over on the side. So that's all I have. I'll turn it back over to David.
Okay, and good afternoon again, everyone. I've seen Dr. Berkowitz, Dr. Berenson, and Kathy Chapman, and Dr. Barr as new additions. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Reedman for getting us started with some remarks.
Okay, so similar to our previous formats, we're going to let Dr. Haft go through some of the feedback we've gotten, and also go through some of the agenda items tonight to start off with, and then we'll eventually move back to our table that we've gotten used to and have those discussions and talk about the feedback we've also gotten from CMS. So in the interest of time and trying to get through a heavy agenda tonight, I'm going to turn it back over to Howard to kind of start off our meeting. So thanks everyone again for taking the time. I know this has been a weekly issue, and I really appreciate the time that everybody's put into this. So okay. Howard, I'll turn it over to you.
Alana, you can bring up the SIP presentation. Dr. Haft.
Sure. Yeah. First, thank you, Michael, David, Ben, and your entire team at MHCC who do a wonderful job of organizing and presenting this. Tonight, I wanted to first thank everyone for the work in the edits and comments you put in the annual report for 2019. That's now been published, sent to CMMI, and has been distributed to all of the advisory council members and others. So I think it does a good job of telling a first-year story, and the second-year story is going to be even more interesting with COVID. But the work that we're doing here tonight, I wanted to start by just making sure that we fully unpacked for everyone in the advisory council all the details of primary care first, since primary care first is the model that we're building on top of. But in order to build on top of, or in order to modify it appropriately to fit Maryland's unique environment and needs, I think we should all at least have the same understanding about the elements. And I think we've talked about the payments, and we've talked about the payment for the performance adjustments. Is it now another big part of this program is the way that it addresses, or it is, or the portion of it that addresses the seriously ill populations. That's called out as a specific portion of the program. And I just wanted to spend 15 or 20 minutes walking through that and then answering any questions. The questions that I answer will only be based on, my answers will be based on what I've read in the RFA. So I really am only being a bit of a translator and a framer for this, because I don't think that there are not many other answers, because it is not really rolled out yet. But let's walk through the slides. Next slide.
Dr. Haft, do you want questions along the way, or was it your inclination to hold to the end?
Questions along the way is fine.
Very good.
Yep. So in the overall program, in the overall primary care first program, there are 3 approaches to the seriously ill program options. One is SIP standalone. That is in organizations that can be standalone organizations that only serve SIP patients, and they serve them for the period of time that is allotted for SIP patients. We'll talk about all of what that means. We haven't decided, and CMMI has not opined one way or the other, whether we would have a SIP standalone in Maryland, if that's going to be part or not part of our program. And we can talk about that certainly as we move forward. The other is the SIP hybrid, that is practices that are within the program that are willing to take seriously ill patients, either from outside of their practice and bring them into their practice, and then presumably keep them in their practice, or identify patients who may already be in the practice, but probably not, but have some relationship to the practice, and accept them as a SIP patient for a period of time that's allowed under the SIP program, or have non-SIP practices, that is practices that say, we're just going to do patients that we have now. Anyone who's identified as a seriously ill patient would, under the description that we'll go through, we would not be willing to accept that person or their care. So those are the 3 options that exist. But we'll focus tonight just on the assumption that we are SIP hybrid, that the practices that we have in the program would say we can take care of any patient, including patients who are seriously ill, and if they migrate into our practices, we'll care for them. That's arguable, but let's go from that perspective. Next slide. So here's the objectives, as stated, that people with serious illness often receive care that doesn't align with their preferences and the goals under the traditional fee-for-service payment model, which can lead to fragmented and siloed care and poor care coordination. The objective of the SIP component is to identify those people who are experiencing fragmented and uncoordinated care under Medicare fee-for-service and deliver intensive episodic intervention to stabilize their clinical condition, and then establish a meaningful relationship between that person and a beneficiary and a practitioner who is accountable for coordinating and managing the care in the longer term. So basically, it's identifying people who fall into this category and then bringing them into a short-term program, short-term being a year or less, and stabilizing them, bringing them back to some degree of health, and then handing them off to a long-term care provider, as in an MDPCP practice. Next slide. So SIP characteristics, there's 2 big categories. One is they're defined by serious illness first, and the serious illness definition, how they would be attributed to be in this category of a SIP patient. They have to have a significant chronic or other serious illness defined as an HCC score of 3 or greater, and it's 1 or more of these. It doesn't need to be all of these. So anyone with an HCC score 3 or greater have a high hospital utilization in the context of chronic illness, demonstrated by both an HCC score between 2 and 3, and 2 or more unplanned hospital admissions in the previous 12 months. It's a little unclear what is an unplanned hospital admission, but I think that may come out later as what's unplanned. Or show signs of frailty as evidenced by a DME claim submitted to Medicare by a provider or supplier for a hospital bed or transfer equipment. So it's 1 or more of those would would put somebody in that category. But then move on, next slide. They would also have fragmentation of care. So in addition to those things, they would have to have no single practice provided more than half of their E&M visits. So sometimes this includes specialist practices. So if a patient, for instance, came to your practice once, but then they saw a specialist 3 or 4 times, but hadn't come back to see you, that would be fragmented care. Or if they saw multiple specialists, that would be fragmented care. Of course, if they saw multiple primary cares, that would also be fragmented care. But it's defined by the E&M visits, not necessarily primary care E&M visits, but just more E&M visits than the plurality of visits for a single practice. And then the beneficiary has 2 or more emergency department visits or observation stays in the 12 months. That's considered fragmentation of care. And then there's a broad category that says such other claims-based criteria as may be set forth in the participation agreement, which I think now, I believe the participation agreements are probably out for primary care first. I can't confirm that. Next slide. So, and then what happens once these patients are identified, the steps in developing an intensive, time-limited intervention for a seriously ill beneficiary. So these are the steps. First is proactively engaging the beneficiary who may have been suffering from SIP in a lack of effective care management under fragmentation under Medicare. So it's engaging them and then facilitating goals of care conversations to understand what's important to those beneficiaries. So it's bringing them into a program that will immediately engage in these conversations, developing a care plan to achieve those goals, and then executing the care plan through a combination of face-to-face and not face-to-face coordination. And then finally, facilitating a relationship, kind of the outward bound part of facilitating a relationship between that beneficiary who's undergone all of these things and to a long-term care, to a longer-term care person who would no longer be considered as SIP. Next slide. So the attribution, SIP only or hybrid practices, for the hybrid practice to get patients attributed to them, this is the attribution. They have to describe in their application the service area from which they're willing to accept beneficiaries using zip codes as descriptors. So this is if our practices, your practice, wanted to be a SIP, you'd have to, even in the hybrid version, you'd have to say what zip codes can you serve. Note the maximum number of attributed beneficiaries that practice can manage at a particular time, which is probably related to the bandwidth of your care management team. CMS then will assign the beneficiaries to the practice's approved service area to the practice, starting with beneficiaries that live closest to that practice. And then on a limited basis, CMS will allow SIP only and hybrid practices to identify and refer beneficiaries for model participation under the SIP component, even if they don't meet the claims-based criteria for SIP. So if you identify someone, you say, this is really a seriously ill patient, and I think they need to come in SIP. You can do that, but it can't be somebody you're already taking care of. So if you're already taking care of them, that wouldn't work. It'd have to be somebody that you just know from some other relationship that they're in need, and you said, I'll identify this patient, do all of those things. So that's how they would get attributed to your practice. Next slide. The onboarding, once a patient is identified, following identification, CMS will then reach out to the beneficiary themselves in order to solicit their interest in the model. So the first step is CMS says, okay, we think you have fragmented care and you're seriously ill. Are you willing to sign on? If they sign on, CS will immediately notify the provider, will immediately provide the contact information to the SIP practice through a secure information transfer method. So patient says yes, CMS sends you notice within 24 or 48 hours. And then the practices are then expected to reach out to the beneficiary as soon as possible within 24 hours and say, you're mine. They'll have up to 60 days to engage that beneficiary in a face-to-face visit. If that doesn't happen in 60 days, they fall off the agenda. But ideally it's within 24 hours. Next slide. So the SIP transitions, now this is how they leave. They must develop a transition plan and communicate that transition plan at the end of a period that we'll talk about in a few minutes. The practices have to develop a transition plan to communicate that transition plan to the SIP beneficiary and obtain the approval of the beneficiary, and then transfer the beneficiary's detailed care to the receiving practitioner, ensuring that the patient understands which practitioner is responsible for their longer-term care, facilitate a warm handoff, and schedule the first appointment with the practitioner that they're being transitioned to, maybe even arranging transportation to that appointment. So that's again the more detail on when the patients are leaving, what's expected of the SIP provider. Next slide. Step for hybrid practices, transitioning a beneficiary will look a lot like step down in care rather than transition to another practitioner. So if this patient is not going, if you're a practice, you've accepted somebody from the outside and they're going to stay in your practice, this is what's going to happen. First, they will get stepped down. The monthly payments that you receive the higher level during their SIP period of 8 to 12 months will be stepped down. And CMS will encourage the hybrid practices to maintain an annual average length of attribution to care for the beneficiaries that are staying within your practice to 8 months. When rarely will allow up to 12 months, and rarely after that if they really need further stabilization. I think that's going to be a discussion with CMS that says I need more time and more payments to stabilize this patient, but the 8 month bar is an important one, because on the average, if you exceed 8 months for any of these beneficiaries with payments for these beneficiaries within your practice, if the average over a period of a year is more than 8 months, then you are no longer able to gain back part of the payments that are withheld from you. So the 8 months is a magic number, although patients can stay in to your practice for longer, but the longer they stay in, the shorter other beneficiaries need to stay in order to balance it out, in order to retain either the additional $25 or $50 per beneficiary per month. We'll talk about it in a minute. Next slide. So the SIP payments component provides a time-limited step up in relative payments relative to Medicare fee-for-service and higher than the primary care first general component of payment. So the payments are higher than either the population-based payments or Medicare fee-for-service in this program, but it's time limited. And again, it's time limited to, on the average, 8 months. Once the beneficiaries achieve clinical stabilization, care intensity is expected to decline, and the higher level of payment under the SIP component is no longer necessary. And the SIP practices have to notify CMS when they've transitioned a patient out of the SIP component, which then ends the higher SIP payments. Next slide. The payments, so here's how they work. Beginning the month following the first face-to-face visit, the practice will receive $275 per beneficiary per month for a kind of average 8 months, beginning in that month, minus $50, which is a withhold. The $50 withhold will be calculated on a per beneficiary per month basis, but if the practice earns it back, it's paid annually in the lump sum after the performance year. So the withhold is held back, and if you meet the certain criteria, both quality and this average length, this average time in the SIP program for all of your beneficiaries, then you can earn this back. SIP practices have the opportunity to earn back the $50 base rate, as well as the additional $50 quality bonus. And then the way that this is, again, metered out is that in order to get both of those, you need to have an average of no more than 8 months of time in the SIP program for any of the patients who are relegated to SIP in your practice. Next slide. Practices exceed the 8 month length of attribution will receive a $50 per beneficiary month reduction in their monthly SIP payment. After the participating practice submitted a claim for the first face-to-face visit. So the initial visit has to be a face-to-face one. The beneficiary will be then officially attributed to the practice, and the monthly SIP payments will start. There'll be a one-time, for that initial visit, a one-time $325 visit for that face-to-face for the SIP beneficiary. After that, any face-to-face visits would be the flat fee of $40.82 for each face-to-face or presumably telemedicine visits. I'm sorry, face-to-face visit, not telemedicine visits. Although it's expected that the care would be provided both in face-to-face and by virtual visits, home visits, and other things. Next slide. So some adjustments. The big adjustments are a practice transition success rate will be defined as the share of SIP beneficiaries with 0 hospitalizations or emergency department visits in the 3 months following their transition out of the SIP component. If a practice's transition success rate, so this says after you transition these patients either to somebody else or you're keeping them in your practice, but you're no longer getting the elevated rates. If they have, after that time in the next 3 months, if they have hospital or ED visits that exceed some yet to be determined benchmark, then you'll not be eligible to get either your performance bonus or a quality bonus. So that's the care transitions is the first adjustment. The second adjustment is the average length of stay that they are in the program. Go on to the next slide. That's the average length of stay. So if you exceed 8 months on the average, then you'll lose that $50 bonus. The first one is you lose both the 50 for the withhold and 50 for quality. And then next slide is quality, should be quality adjustments. So if the practice meets the average attribution and the transition success rate, if they meet both of those and they're able to theoretically get both the withhold and the $50 additional quality, then they're measured using the same quality measures that we talked about previously in risk group 3 and group 4. We did that last week. So in order to keep that, they'll need to practices that meet the 70th percentile as compared to reference population will keep that whole $50. Practices that are between 50 and 70th percentile will earn back their performance withhold, but not the additional quality bonus. So if you exceed 70 in the quality piece, you've done everything else and you exceed 70th percentile, you'll get both. You can keep the quality and the withhold. If you're between 50 and 70, you just get to keep the withhold. As compared to reference, will earn back the withhold, but not the quality. And if you're below 50, you get nothing again. Next slide.
Hey, Howard, it's Patrick. Do you mind if I ask a question?
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay. So has any math kind of been done on the difference between, once you lump in the monthly payments and the performance payments, what the difference would be for a SIP patient that then transitions to, I'll call it a normal MDPCP patient, and what the difference in PM would be for that beneficiary? And the reason I ask is if the numbers are substantially higher, which is my assumption, for the SIP beneficiary, because CMI believes that the practices will then invest in additional resources to really, wrap these individuals and really get them engaged in care. But those heightened SIP payments trader after 8 to 12 months max, I just worry about the financial sustainability of the model itself, unless you kind of are getting a steady stream of new SIP patients. Otherwise, you won't be able to sustain any additional resources that kind of you've specifically hired for those beneficiaries. So I was just wondering if that had kind of been looked at yet.
So we're doing, so Patrick, it's a great question. Thank you. We're doing some modeling on many aspects. SIP is one of those aspects that we're doing some modeling. The first portion of the modeling is just seeing how many SIP patients we have in Maryland. So it's the pool that we're looking at, people that who meet those eligibility criteria to the extent that we can. The frailty part is a little hard to get to. We are looking also and made some significant headway on just doing a broader modeling and the kind of the financial impact of what we know about the overall primary care first program that, we talked about this last week a little bit with if we took our current track 2 practices and plunked them down, just lifted and shifted into primary care first, what that would look like in terms of their overall Medicare revenue, an advantage or disadvantage, and then also taking a look at how the different, whether using the different payment models, whether we using the patient, the groups that are there now in primary care first, group 1, 2, 3, and 4, how many of our practices would be in each of those groups, and then what the benefits in each of those, whether they would be benefited or not benefited, and what their financial impacts would be. We've prioritized doing those big financial impacts, and there's a good deal of work that's been done on that already. And I anticipate probably not next week, but the week after, that we'll have a presentation from our contractors and a very vigorous discussion about what that looks like, what those models look like, and at that time. But right now, I would say that for the short term, certainly the SIP looks like it provides some additional per beneficiary per month revenues. But the question, of course, is if you have to build a team to support that, and if the revenues wax and wane from month to month or from quarter to quarter, is that sustainable? And we haven't modeled that out yet. So long answer to we don't have an answer to that yet.
And Dr.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. No, I was going to say thank you for looking into it. I appreciate it.
And Dr. Haft, we have a question from Laura Goodman.
Yes.
Laura, can you speak at this stage? Okay, she may be on mute. We can come back to Laura.
Okay. I'm going to go on to the next slide then. I don't think there's many more. There was a termination of service criteria. So the program itself, the period of service, will last for up to 12 months or until one of the following: the beneficiary opts out, practice notifies CMMI that's been transitioned out, the beneficiary began receiving hospice care, moved out of the practice area, or died. So next slide. And CMS will be monitoring practices that have a low rate of success in engaging SIP patients, as defined by whether or not whether their first face-to-face visit is billed, or practices have a high rate of success in engaging SIP with little subsequent claims-based evidence that services are being provided. CMS may terminate those practices' participation in the model and seek repayment of all or a portion of the PBPM. I think that's the last slide. So we'll stop there and see if there's any other questions.
Dr. Haft, so we have Laura Goodman who is trying to ask a question. Laura, let's try again. And if not, if you want to just send your message via email, Melanie will be able to read it for the group. So why don't you try that approach? So let's start with Dr. Berenson.
Thanks. That was very interesting. And it just sort of coincidentally, I'm doing some work just now for medical home visiting practices that have been part of independence at home, right, and caring for patients who not only are seriously ill, but they have, by definition, limitations of activities of daily living, and a goodly number of them are technically homebound. They can't leave their apartment without a lot of assistance. It's sort of a subpopulation of seriously ill patients. The people in that program, as I understand it, are being told that CMMI wants to do away with it and move them into the SIP program. I'm just going to quote from an issue brief that one of their proponents, one of their experts has written. What about those SIP patients who did not stabilize within the 12-month SIP window? And what about the approximately 2 million high-need patients who already have an established source of primary care, presumably with some of those practices? These patients will need greater support and resources than the PCF model provides. They're basically saying that that subpopulation they're basically saying we've got a successful demonstration, the independence at home, and why would we want to do away with that and move people into practices? My question is that some of these patients are homebound, and our practices really willing, the belief is that they need home visiting rather than expecting these patients to come to the office. Our practice is willing to exert that kind of, develop that kind of activity. Now, I think that program was developed before the current rage of telehealth, and that offers some real potential, I think. But I wonder whether that population is appropriate for PCF, I guess is the question, or whether practices actually want to care for that. About 2 million patients across the country who would meet their criteria for both being seriously ill and having functional limitations.
Bob, I think it's an interesting and a good question. I know that we do have practices that in the program that do home care. That not some do it. Many do home visits. Many, a few are just exclusively taking care of homebound patients. So that's their niche, if you will. And not even outside of the Independence at Home program. So that also exists. I know there's some work that Hopkins has done in that regard in Baltimore also. But I think that it's a very good question that how do you for patients who are homebound, how do we support them, and if there are that segment of the SIP patients who specifically cannot get to an office, is telehealth can be sufficient? Is our home nurse practitioner visits going to be sufficient? I know we do have a growing number of patients also, interestingly, who we've connected up through screening and determining that they have food instability, and connected them up to Meals on Wheels, and they are largely homebound or very home limited patients who get those services. And that's been a really interesting connection, because the Meals on Wheels folks actually go out on 5 days a week and connect up with the practices and provide kind of boots on the ground observations. They're not medical professionals, but they make observations about and checklists about whether they have medications, whether there's some other needs that need to be fulfilled, and encourage visits back to the primary care. And there's a communication channel there. So, but all that I think is pale in comparison to the really underlying truth that you said, is that many of those patients need a lot more support and financial support to meet all their needs and what they're going to get in this program.
But it just occurs to me, I should have thought of this earlier, that the sort of the heads of this whole movement towards home-based visiting is Bruce Leff, who's at Hopkins. And it might make perfect sense to have a conversation with Bruce about how his concerns about losing his program and our desire to actually do this right without overburdening practices who may not have the resources to take care of this population, how that can work out. So I guess I'm suggesting that maybe you and others, I don't know who the right people are, would interact with Bruce to talk about how this could work out, how this could roll out correctly. Do you know Bruce at all?
Talked to him once or twice, but I don't know him well.
Okay. Well, he's the go-to guy in the country, actually, on this program, and I think it makes perfect sense for him to be aware of what we're doing and for us to interact with him.
And Dr. Berenson, could you restate Bruce's last name for the recording?
Yeah. And his article is in the February 18, 2020 Health Affairs blog. It's called I'll send, it's easy to find. It's called To Strengthen the Primary Care First Model for the Most Frail, Look to the Independence at Home demonstration. And I'll send a link to it afterwards, but it's a pretty good primer. And he actually is quite upset that what he thinks is a successful program might be dismantled as CMS is trying to incredibly engineer this PCF model to do all things for all people.
All right, thank you. So the sequence, Dr. Kiki, Bob, Atlas, and then Melanie for Laura Goodman.
Okay, sure. So I championed an AIC program, which was a partnership between Johns Hopkins Community Physicians and an MCO. And it very much looks like a STIP program. And a few things I wanted to kind of share with you guys, I think we should keep in mind, is the onboarding process. So it's CMS communicating directly to beneficiaries that qualify for this program, and they also communicating with the primary care provider that has been identified, even though they're not, providing comprehensive care. And then when that handoff is going to happen between the SIP provider and the long-term primary care provider, as they've defined that, it causes some kind of friction there. So I'm wondering how they plan to manage that relationship, having that patient rotate around that. That was a big issue. Also, there was not a high enrollment rate with just sending out communication when you identify patients based on claims data. So there was more than that. They needed community health workers and sometimes clinicians to also support with that. And the last piece also was based on the adjustments for quality, looking at performance. I'm wondering if the 70th percentile is the exact same with patients who are not in the SIP program, and are they making adjustments for what that would look like? Because, some patients just by definition may just be have more chronic disease and harder to kind of, work with and coordinate their care. So is there any adjustments made for that as well?
So those are a lot of questions. I imagine there are lots of us who could take a stab at that based upon the RFA. Let's start with Dr. Haff.
So I think for the most of those questions, I don't really have an answer in terms of the adjustments on the quality or or any other, the warm handoffs. It's just stated that there will be warm handoffs, and it's stated that the expectation is that once a patient is identified, that the practice will onboard them. But I think what Dr. Okiki was pointing out is that that those are all very in real life. Those are really challenging things. When you get to patients who have succeeded to the level of being seriously ill and have fragmented care, they are not easy patients to manage around. They didn't get there because they were easy. They got there because they had social and other kinds of things that made it challenging for them to be attached to a single provider. So that's not an answer. It's just saying that it's acknowledging that these are real tough patients.
Yeah, and the RFA notes that some of the care transition requirements, the care teams have to be in place, and the periods of time in which care has to be provided in order to stay in the program. Melanie, was there something else that you were going to add before we go to Bob?
You mean Laura Goodman's question? Did you want me to do that one now, or?
Well, let's hold on that. Let's go to Bob first.
Laura had her hand up earlier. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Melanie.
Okay, so I did try to unmute her, David, but I think I can't because of the phone line. So Laura Goodman's question was, I was wondering about the standalone SIP option and the ability of practices to provide continuity to an individual. This could work well with the chronic health home integration that Scott Rose brought up in the first weeks.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and Scott maybe want to comment on it also. But I think there is certainly the open possibility that that the state could say, as part of this model, that we would welcome or allow standalone SIPs to exist, and it could be a version of chronic health home, or it could be a version of a CTO or some other kinds of organizations. I don't think there's any prohibition for that happening. There are, I didn't go into any detail about the standalone SIPs. They have a little bit different in terms of their quality reporting and things, and they don't require all the same requirements for certified electronic health records, et cetera. But I think it is certainly a possibility.
Okay, Dr. Rose, do you have any comment for what Dr. Haft had mentioned, and we'll keep going?
I just agree with what Howard said. The interesting thing here is that the Medicaid Chronic Health Fund could be a practice as well as taking care of SIP individuals. So I don't think it would necessarily have to be SIP only.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Bob, and then we'll go to Dr. Barr.
Yeah, well, I guess my question almost kind of stitches together all the comments and questions that have come before. Like, do we even know how many Medicare fee-for-service beneficiaries there are in Maryland who would qualify? And, what would be the caseload that an individual practice would get? It would seem that a practice, in order to do this well, would need enough of a caseload to justify the investments in resources to bring to bear. So I'm just wondering about about the practicality, B, about, there's been references to a number of established models like Independence at Home, and this, how well tested is this? Anytime you have a program where you've got complex patients, and you don't have what amounts to a lock-in to the particular practice. I hear words like an attribution and kind of an enrollment and an onboarding, but I don't hear a lock-in, which concerns me that, the practice might try to establish a relationship, but the patient is essentially undisciplined in terms of returning to the practice for routine management, so to speak. And if they don't, how do you enforce whatever so-called contract there is? And I guess ultimately, what is the, thinking big picture here, what is the value to us of incorporating this? Is this an expectation that when we have track 3 that this will be incorporated? If we opt out, is that a problem? How does it fit in the grand scheme of this whole range?
Dr. Haft?
Yeah, so Bob, great quote. First of all, you look presidential tonight. I don't know why, but you do.
I take offense at that, but okay.
no offense. No offense, man.
I mean, maybe you're not referring to the U.S. president. Okay.
Well,
anyway, move on.
Maybe very dignified. So, but we're modeling to see how many SIP patients there would be in the whole universe. There you go. There goes the whole ambiance. So we're modeling with our contractor to see how many there would be, but clearly the number is going to be, whatever that number is, the uptake would be smaller, and the number will be a moment in time. People come in and out of those criteria. But so we'll make, kind of a best estimate on what that might look like. As to whether this is a mandatory part of the program or not, I think it goes back to we are in the process of creating here a program that we think will be modeled after primary care first, using as many of the elements that make sense for Maryland, and we'll offer that up to at the end of the year to CMMI for consideration, and see how that moves forward through the clearance process. So this would be one of the things that I think we would, after we get some data, would say we think it should be included, but modified. We think that we really think that Independence at Home is really what we should continue in the state, or any one of a number of things that I think will rely on the wisdom of the advisory council to guide us and how best to do that. So all are possible now. Maybe we have a different and a better way of dealing with the needs of our patients who would be considered seriously ill in this kind of category. So,
My
and to,
only question, I guess, I just wonder if
nobody,
there's a political element here. Sorry.
go ahead.
Just wonder if there's a political element, you know, kind of is this just the thing that this administration has invented and they just want to, you know, they want to get their thing taken up and they don't want to perpetuate things that were invented under a previous administration.
Yeah. I mean, all things it's all possible, and but it's clearly what we don't know is how this works, because it hasn't been. This is not a model that we have a history on. It said that, you know, over the last year or 5 years, this is what the outcomes were. I think we make some inferences from the independents at home, but I don't know that there's any other model exactly like this SIP. And maybe Bob Berenson or others are aware of something that's similar to this, but I'm not.
So before we move on, we have Dr. Barr who has a question, and then before Dr. Barr, I think Kevin, were you in response to the question from Bob Atlas, or can we? Or you?
Well, just a response to what Dr. Haft was saying. When I read the description of SIP, I immediately thought of Jeffrey Brenner's article about hotspotting.
Right.
Seemed to me like that's another model that might be relevant to this. That's all.
Oh, very good. Very good. Thank you for that. Dr. Barr.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Great conversation. I've been stuck on for a while the cutoffs at the 8 months and the average and the 12-month maximum and the attribution. If I'm understanding correctly, obviously this population by definition has high needs. Is the expectation that, I'm just worried about the consequences of practices who have incentives not to let their average go above 8 months, jettison people early from this more intensive care? Is that even likely that this patient population will be ready for such transitions after 8 months? And if it's not a hybrid practice, they need to know where to transition those folks. And is there a receptive, or what are we doing to make sure that other practices are receptive to getting the transition? So just on that sort of the transitions, the duration, the attribution, how reasonable is that? I have some significant questions about it.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't know the answers for those. I do know that, and maybe Dr. Riedman can opine to this too, because he's very, very active clinically. But my recollection, and it's not been that long ago, is that many of the patients that I cared for who would fall into this kind of category, I mean, in terms of serious illness, perhaps not fragmentation, but at least serious illness, were not necessarily things that I could fix in 8 months and then they got better and didn't need all the support anymore. Many of them had just, you know, very prolonged, ongoing kinds of problems. So I don't know where the eight months is a peculiarity to me. I think it's probably an more actuarial than it is clinical.
I actually agree. I had written that question down actually to talk about that. I'm not sure where the 8 months come from, and I don't know how you can make a decision. Those patients are years of care. They're not 8 months, and we certainly don't want to abandon it. But I tell you, from a financial standpoint, from practice, the practice is going to look at that. Well, if I'm going to be penalized for this, how can I transition this patient somewhere else? I'm not sure where that number comes from, and I think it would be a problem. I agree.
I just wanted to think the Medicare Health Support Program of years ago, one of the challenges was the people they assigned in this high morbidity area, there was very little that they could influence in their care. So those are the ones who wind up in here. The likelihood that they're going to, I mean, I bet you could hope would be to stabilize them, and maybe that's enough to bring them off this program. But the vast majority of them, they couldn't achieve any improvements over the time because they were so far down in their morbidity.
The other concern along those lines is that we're talking about transitioning back to a primary care, but some of the patients, I can't remember who it was at one of our meetings early on, mentioned that they were doing a SIP type program. I don't remember who it was offhand, but that a lot of the primary cares don't want to see those patients. They kicked them out of their practice for non-compliance. They don't want to take them back, and so here's a practice that's required to keep them for 8 months and turn them back over, and the practice to turn them back over doesn't want them anymore. And that's a problem also. A lot of these patients have been non-compliant and practices have already discharged in practice. So that's I agree that 8-12 months is a problem.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. There's nothing in the RFA that talks about non-compliance of patients and what's the alternative to that point under the SIP program. Are there, oh, Dr. Okiki?
And one last thing to add is that if you are successful and you do want to transition the patient from this high-touch AIC program to back to regular PCP care, sometimes you may need an interim or an in-between, because you have all this attention and wraparound care, and then all of a sudden we're going back to probably what was the issue in the first place, where either the provider did not have the bandwidth to provide as much comprehensive care. So also something to think about, that we have the step down, but what does the step down actually entail? What are the different levels of acuity in the step down as they transition out of SFF from the SIP program?
If I might just, and the opposite. What if somebody is in the program and then gets to the step down and then, they're not ready for that? How's the program handle that? I think that's actually pretty likely given some of the patients. And honestly, when we talk about non-adherence and non-compliance, these are really folks who are really challenged for a variety of reasons. I wouldn't block it just onto non-compliance and non-adherence.
That's right.
That's a little bit of a negative in how we're phrasing that. These are people who really have issues.
Yeah, I think it was actually, I remember it was Pat Zapp, I think at one of our early meetings in another committee that was running a similar program to this, and she was the one that had the statement that she has a hard time. The patients she's seeing are ones that a lot of practices have discharged for difficult follow-up, and that it was, once she was here, to took care of them, where do you send those patients? And I think it really goes back to Bar's question, Mike's question, mentioned that that's a big issue with the 8 to 12 months.
Yeah. So just to give you maybe a little bit of insight, I think this may be insight anyway, into where this might have sprung from. As you recall, this was the design, the basic design feature for this came from Adam Bowler. And Adam came to CMMI after having a successful care management program that took risk. And his model was to intensively care for people to reduce their costs and then gain profit from reducing their costs in the shared risk kind of a program. So this is a kind of, comes from the same kind of translation. If I had to translate that into a CMMI model, this is sort of a version of that in a Medicare world. So it's not without some kind of theoretical roots, and it probably works in some settings, but the question is whether this will work in the primary care setting in the same way that it would work in a commercial organization that's geared up to do high-level care management.
So Howard, I think going back to ND Bob's question about whether the Medicare would allow us not to do SIP in some way is an important question, because I think in my mind, if the practices, there may be a number of practices, there may be some that aren't, but there may be a number of practices that are willing to take care of these patients as a level. We talked about a higher level than a higher track than 3 or 4, some along those lines, but at the same time that they take care of their own patients. I certainly personally would be willing to, and I already do take care of some of these patients myself in my practice. I don't have to transition anybody else. I take care of my practice. I think that's a better model than in general, although there's some patients obviously going to need something along these lines where no one else can take care of them.
Yeah. So practices would have the option, at least as it's designed now, to say we're non-SIP, we're not going to take any external patients, we'll just care for our own patients. Or they could be hybrid and say, still going to take care of my own patients, but I'll accept others. So that flexibility would be there. It would be up to the practices to decide whether they want to accept these SIP patients. So that's the basic premise. So there is that flexibility.
Yes. Any other questions for Dr. Haft on the presentation of the SIP program? Okay. So Dr. Reed, any comments before we continue onward?
No, I thought that was a good conversation. Thanks for doing that, Howard.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we're actually going to turn back to Howard, Dr. Haft. Alana, can you bring up the table from responses from CMMI, and then we'll invite Dr. Haft to take us through this conversation.
By the way, Howard, you look very, very professional tonight also. I just wanted to comment on that.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I don't have any dollars to show you, but so so for the advisory council members, we responded to CMMI with the comments from the last 2 weeks, and then they in turn responded with some additional questions and responses. I'll just walk through these and see where everyone is on this. The first one was pretty simple, straightforward, regarding FQHCs. CMMI simply responded that their discussions with the organization in CMS that does payments for FQHCs would be doing payments for FQHCs in this model, CM. That they're resuming the discussions with them, and they'll keep us updated. And the question really has to do with track 2 payments, which will require some unique kind of financial manipulations with the current EPS system. It's the Center for Medicare handles those payments. So that there's really I don't know if there's any discussion. We're just waiting to hear back from them on that. And then on the CTO, which was one of the other, we had opined that we would like to keep CTOs. The CMS said this doesn't address why, and we said basically that they're very popular. The 75 or 80% of the practices use them. That they particularly provide resources to small, medium-sized practices. And the CMMI said it didn't directly say why those services couldn't be provided without having CMS involved. And then they said further, their analysis said the practice size and CTO shows that smaller, medium-sized practices don't use CTOs at a higher rate than larger practices. I think that's probably true. Many practices are using CTOs, so both small, medium, and large. And they wanted to consider releasing the CTOs from the confines, as they call it, of a CMS PA, which offer more flexibility for individualizing business relations arrangements. So just get some comments from the advisory council on that. We've taken the perspective that having the participation agreement is a bit of a burden, but it also defines certain kind of guardrails for which CTOs perform in, and that the other thing that would be missing if they didn't have a PA is that we'd have to go back to practices individually negotiating contracts one at a time with their CTOs, rather than having it be in the practices then having to write checks to the CTOs for those services, rather than having be a direct a part of the overall program. And also, CTOs would not be getting the CCLF data that they get now from CMS. So there was a number of reasons that we thought that made sense, but I'll leave that open to discussion.
So Bob had a question, Bob Atlas, and then I would invite Patrick Dooley and Gene Ransom to weigh in, but let's start with Bob.
Yeah, well, I do want to hear from those gentlemen. I mean, this sounds like CMS saying that it's a bother for them to deal with the CTOs, and so if you guys want them, you can keep them, but we don't want to be in the business of administering that. And as I raised my hand, Howard, you brought up a couple of the issues as to why having CMS in the middle and is valuable. So, I think we do. This certainly isn't enough reason for us to walk away from the CTOs. How definitive is their disinterest in continuing our relationship with CTOs, and can we do without?
So, Dr. Haft, thoughts?
I think that's really the heart of the question, is that they haven't as much said that they, but it does add some more things for them to do. But I think we're creating, a unique statewide healthcare delivery and payment system. This is part of that healthcare delivery and payment system, or care transformation organizations. This is what we crafted, and I'm not sure whether it's right or wrong, but we've crafted that as part of what the state is uniquely doing, with the hope and expectation that perhaps that's something that's of value and could be replicated elsewhere. Saying it's a bother, and is not, to me, a good reason to say, well, we don't need to do it because it's a bother, if it's bringing value and creating resources that could be both serve Maryland and serve as a model for other places. So that's where I am.
Patrick, are you able to weigh in?
This is Gene. I'm ready to, if you want. If he's not.
Go ahead, Gene. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think we need to fight on this one, because I can tell you. I mean, let's be honest. MedChi essentially has the CTO of last resort, for all intents and purposes. And the 20 or so practices we have now, a good number of them would not be in it if it were not for us helping them. And the 10 or 15 or so we signed up this fall to be added in wouldn't be in it. So if we don't want to help the little guys, the small practices, then walk away from the CTO, because there's no way that the level of administrative help they need is going to be done unless they work with an entity like this. I really don't understand why CMS, this doesn't cost them any more money. If a physician wants to go without a CTO, it's the same cost whether they're with one or not. And I just feel that a lot of the docs will not participate and we'll lose people. And then the problem is the people who we will lose, because they don't want to take the time to do this, are the ones who have the most expensive patients. Look at the patients in my CTO. They're some of the most expensive patients in the state, because we're talking about people who, frankly, I had doctors in our CTO when we started who didn't know what a TCM code was. They really need a lot of help. They weren't used to value-based payment. So I don't understand why you would want to eliminate these. And then the other question I would have is, who's going to cover all the administrative costs that the CTOs are handling? Because even the bigger hospital CTOs are doing a large amount of administrative work. Howard's coaches are excellent and they do a great job and they keep us straight. But we do a lot of stuff too to make sure that everybody's compliant and things are happening. Is CMS going to increase the staff to help manage all this? Or are they going to give the state some administrative money? I just think this is short-sighted, and I don't really understand it, and I think we should fight to keep them.
Good point. Thank you, Gene.
I agree with Gene's enthusiasm on this issue. I think he's absolutely right about it. I think that, by the way, what are TCMs, Gene?
CC.
Transitional care codes. Oh, sorry.
I know.
Sorry, I fell for it.
No, I think he's absolutely right about the fact that we've had a couple conversations in our previous meetings that the groups that are doing this are learning. That's not what we do for a living. Even our group that's larger and a little more sophisticated, we're learning as we go along, and we're trying to figure this out. And our participation in this TTO has helped us transition during the early phases of this. Now, long term, we all need CTOs. Well, hopefully we may not, but certainly early on and with the smaller practices, I don't see how we'd be able to do this without the CTOs. So I know, Patrick, you had some comments?
And then Dr. Burke.
Sure. And I'll agree with a lot of the things Gene said. I understand CMS's point that, why couldn't all of these practices still just separately contract with these CTOs? But I think then you're relying on each CTO and each physician practice to come up with a contract that they're going to go back and forth on and have to negotiate. And then to Gene's point, while care management and other things may be a little standardized, there are a lot of kind of, subject matter expertise, time and services that are provided to these practices. And do you really want to start getting into, a billable hour scenario for all of these different, CTOs with these independent practices? It just, to me, it could be a logistical nightmare that undermines some of the strengths of the program. So, so if the role of the CTOs has to change over time, if CMS has perspective on, the level of services that a primary care first practice may need versus a track 1 MDPCP, I think there's a legitimate conversation to have. However, at the same time, to Gene's point, I think there's been a lot of value in the CTOs, and I wouldn't want just kind of a a logistical or administrative reason be the reason that we pull the rug on them.
Yeah, good point. Dr. Reedman or Dr. Haft, any reaction there?
I agree with all of the above, and point out that the largest part of the administrative burden for CTOs, all of the arrangements and the communications, monthly meetings, and those things actually don't fall on CMMI. It falls on the state. Our program management office manages, I would say, the vast majority of those administrative details for the CTOs, and we're happy to do so. We think that they're valuable.
Any reaction, Dr. Reedman?
No, I agree. I agree 100%. Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Oh, sorry.
No, I think Scott, he raised his hand.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to echo the points that have been made. I agree with Gene and Patrick's comments. I think that the CTOs help with a lot of administrative efficiencies, and there's a significant amount of programmatic work there. The only piece I would add in reading CMMI's comments there is that I do believe that to the extent that there can be more flexibility that's added, some of the language, whether in the participation agreement or the CTO arrangements, have a decent amount of program components and requirements. And so perhaps to the extent that there is able to be a lessening of that, to have some of that flexibility, perhaps there's a way to thread the needle a bit in terms of those different viewpoints about the CTO and allowing that flexibility.
Good point. Good point. Kathy Chapman, I don't know if this is a good point for you to weigh in or if you're able to.
Actually, I was going to weigh in on a different subject if I can.
No worries, please.
Okay. All right. I have to voice, I'm probably the lone dissenter, but I do disagree with including FQHCs. I worked at an FQHC 10 years ago. They did case management then. They have a care manager. They had a pharmacy manager. Many of the things, all the things pretty much that are being, that are done through the MDPCP program are part of a FQHC. As a small, independent, privately owned practice, the more money you give to entities such as FQHCs in the rural practice, the harder it is to compete with them. I cannot put color page ads. I cannot have a marketing director like one of the FQHCs lately does. So I think little by little, the more finances that are given to the bigger entities, you're going to end up in the rural practice with hospital-based primary care and FQHCs, and there will be very little, if any, private practice PCP primary care, privately owned primary care practices.
Dr. Haft?
So I appreciate the comment, and certainly, I think from the FQHC's perspective, they don't feel that way, and it may be different FQHCs, have different, financial structures and supports and those kinds of things. But we did match up as we built this model to include them. We did match up what they are currently compensated for under the prospective payment system (PPS) and what they would get for expected to do for care management fees. And there's a significant difference. They're getting paid for will get paid for doing different things. So that's a point. But more than that, I think it's my view for this, and with absolutely complete respect to where the situation that you're in and having to compete is building, from our state's perspective, is building a unified primary care workforce that's doing all the same great things across the state, that has the support of the state public health and is able to move in essence in lockstep when necessary to respond to the needs of the population. Not to say that you do anything different caring for patients one at a time, but when big things happen like COVID or other big things happen, which they inevitably do, or time for flu immunizations, that we can provide kind of a unified force to do that. My view for that is to be more inclusive than exclusive. So, and I think that's the state's view. That's our our requirement under the total cost of care is to broadly transform the way we deliver healthcare. But I absolutely understand, Kathy, what you're saying, and if there's any help that we can give in making you more competitive, we're happy to do that also.
So Ben, and then Dr. Berenson. Oh, Kathy, go ahead. You're on mute, I believe.
Right. I just said, send me some of those federal dollars. I'd be good with that.
Hopefully.
Ben?
Yeah, I had a very short call out to Will, Daniel, if he's here, but I think we need to pay attention to considerations that the HSCRC is making in terms of trying to embed more accountability on hospitals that participate in CT as CTOs, because depending on how that is worked out, the incentive to serve as a CTO could potentially diminish, or the willingness of hospitals to engage in the full suite of practices that are now being supported by a hospital may diminish. So it's important to pay attention to the interplay between the hospital side model and the primary care model as we contemplate how CTOs could be included in the next track, if at all.
Good point. Dr. Berenson.
Yeah, I was going to say that I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that FQHCs are cost-based as it is, and their marketing director is already being paid for, so I don't think including them would give them extra than what they're already getting. It would change how they're getting paid and moving them from pure fee schedules to more value-based payments. So I think that's desirable, but I don't think your situation would be any worse in competition with the FQHCs. Howard, do you think that's correct?
I think that's correct. As you said, they are cost-based. This would the move into track 2 and then into track 3 would just shift them from what is basically a fee-for-service version of cost-based reimbursements to population-based payments.
Right.
And I can't tell, but I think Dr. Rose, did you have a comment here?
No, I just lost connection and reconnected. Sorry.
Okay, very good. So Dr. Haft, I think we're good to continue onward.
Okay, good. The last part of their comment was just, and probably doesn't need much more, what happens to CTOs after the end of the model? So in the end time, I don't think we know what happens in the end time because it hasn't happened yet. So I think what the question probably is more directed at, if the model continues, with CMS be required to continue to do the shared payments to CTOs, and I think we're saying yes. If it continues, we would want it to continue in that way. Other than that, I'm not sure how to interpret that question.
Okay.
So we can move on.
Scroll down one. Yeah.
So we had talked about keeping the advanced primary care functions, such as we already have, as part of the core of the program, and thinking that in primary care first, there's basically the same kind of structure that says that practices have capabilities to do these advanced primary care functions, and we said we would keep the same primary care advanced functions, limiting with a limited set of reporting requirements. And CMS said, what do you envision this reporting to look like? And more specifically, what are the goals of reporting in this context, helpful to approach reporting requirements in terms of its intent rather than its length. So I think the intent, would simply to say that we want to know that The practices that are in the program are probably to reduce the administrative burden on an annual basis, not on a more frequent basis as was originally designed, but to know what advanced practice care functions the practices are performing and to what extent. We find it very valuable to know, for instance, that that care management is done for 10 or 15% of the patients and reported that on an annual basis, or that practices are doing things like telehealth or have implemented and are doing behavioral health integration or expert or those kinds of things. And if they were done on a simple and in an annualized basis to reduce reporting requirements, or incorporated on an automated basis that didn't require additional effort by the practice, all of those parameters are really important parameters about understanding the care that's delivered and vicariously the health of the population. So we'd want to continue to collect some information about how practices are doing with those things in as little intrusive way as possible, recognizing that one of our mantras is let's reduce administrative burden. So we've reduced it already from 4 times to twice a year, and this would be reducing it to once a year, but still giving visibility. So if somebody says, what do these practices do? We'd be able to say, here's exactly what they do. And I point to our first annual report as evidence of how powerful that is.
Just to comment on, I know I feel like a broken record sometimes about the administrative burden, but I was having a conversation with one of my partners the other day, and what we were discussing was the fact that the programs are designed to allow us, or to compensate us in particular, to see less patients and spend more time with our critically ill patients and more time with patients. And what's happening is we're actually spending more time doing administrative work and documentation, and instead of concentrating on the patients and spending the time on the patients, we're spending it doing a lot of administrative burden, and that totally defeats the purpose of what we're supposed to be doing. So I know we keep having that conversation, but I think every time we have any kind of discussion, that should be in the back of our minds about how can we reduce the administrative burden, allow the providers to do what they want to do, and that's take care of the patients, improve their quality care, but not add more paperwork and administration and documentation on top of it. Just to emphasize your point, Howard.
Okay. Any other comments at this point before Dr. Half continues onward? Oh, Dr. Okiki.
Could we also make it optional for practices to either report once a year or twice? I would say no more than that. But some practices would like to measure in the middle, just to have a sense of how well are we doing, and are we also trying to also promote or introduce interim ways that providers can gauge what's working, what's not? I think a whole year going on doing the same thing with not being very clear on where you stand is not a good way to QI any process. So just wondering if 2 reporting per year, you must report at the end of 1 year, optional for the one at the 6-month mark, but just your thought around how measuring in the middle helps improve care transformation.
Yeah, and Kim, I think that's a great point, and I think it's maybe 2 different things that we're talking about. One is the actual process of reporting to an agency, and the other, which is probably much more relevant, is internally looking at your own data and being able to say, this is how I'm doing here, which maybe could be even more frequent than twice a year, maybe under the guidance of a care transformation organization, or maybe as an internal process to continually improve and understand where you are with those parameters. So I think that, to me, the best of all worlds is to be able to continually be able to understand where you are in terms of meeting these requirements, and then only have to report it to somebody else who's going to use it for policy making or other things in a limited basis. But you're absolutely right. If you only look at it once a year, it doesn't. If you're the person who's doing this and you only look at what you're doing once a year in an objective way, you probably miss a lot of opportunities. Great point.
So where I see the benefit is if providers or practices have the flexibility to determine what that interim reporting is, then if they're okay to consolidate that, and that's what CMS gets to have, then at least it doesn't disrupt, at least their process flow and increase the administrative burden. Just a thought, but yeah.
Good point. Dr. Haft, any reaction here?
No, I agree.
Okay, we'll just for the clock purposes, we have about 6 more minutes before we need to begin to wrap up. Dr. Haft.
Let's see what the next. So this was, I think, probably just a point that they were making for as a clarification. We copied, in terms of eligibility for FQHCs, that essentially was the same eligibility with the exception of the FQHCs are counted by the organization rather than the individual practice. And they noted that FQHCs, we do not define eligible practitioners, and all primary care services are considered eligible regardless of practitioner type. So we just acknowledge, I don't think that has any, we just acknowledge that. I don't think it has any other impact, at least that I know of. And then CMS said that, asked the question, would the 70% requirement apply to FQHCs? That is 70% of the practice's eligible primary care practitioners' combined revenue must come from primary care services. As far as I know, it would apply. I think this is a question we'll have to ask our FQHC colleagues to see if that causes a problem. Not one that I is immediately am aware of.
Any reactions from council members here? Okay, Dr. Haft.
Good. We can go on then. And then on the having experience with value-based payments is one of the requirements for primary care first. We agreed. CMMI said, give us the details. We simply gave them back the details that were in the RFA and said that that practices would have experience with this. And they said, how will they assess the experience for direct entry of new applicants to track 3? What are examples of value-based payments? How much experience do they need? Are arrangements with other payers acceptable experience? And I think the answer is, how will they assess the experience? It was by attestation from the RFA for primary care first, and saying that you've had experience with ACOs or a program like MDPCP that is a value-based program. I don't have any other additional way to explain that. And then they asked, what is the plan for transition from track 2 to track 3? What are the key indicators other than time spent in track 2? And I don't think we had anticipated that there would be any additional requirements other than those that are requirements to agree to go into primary care first and agree to sign a participation agreement. So we didn't anticipate other additional requirements. And can practice move from track 1 to track 3. And I would anticipate that they could move from track 1 to track 3 if they met the requirements for having had experience with value-based payments for at least a year. So we'd have to have 1 year in track 1.
So Ben had a question, Dr. Haft?
I think we have to keep in mind, I'm digging up that press release from Care First earlier this year, which Care First committed to having aligned a program. I think we need to call out what graduation or migration from a Care First only program into track 3 would actually mean. I detect in a lot of this more specificity on the part of CMMI in terms of what we're doing. And to the extent we can do that, I think we're going to make some smoother headway going forward. So I think there's some opportunity we ought to pursue with Care First to think about what that, what they think the requirements are to signal elements of success in track 3 if the practice is a good performer on the Care First program, but has not up to this point joined MDPCP. There probably aren't really that many, but there are some. The other, we also ought to be thinking of how we draft Dr. Pham into this discussion on how we loop in the Anthem AmeriGroup concepts to get their input. They are, committed. I think they could be useful in providing some of the specificity that it seems as though our friends at CMMI are yearning for.
Yeah, Ben, I think that's a great point, and that's great reading between the lines, and I really appreciate that. We will certainly reach out to both of them to see if we can get some input. Thank you so much.
Okay.
So we've got about 2 minutes left, so I'd like to go ahead and wrap things up. I think we're still planning to go to continue with our Tuesday meetings. I again appreciate everybody's time and effort and all this. I thought it's a great conversation on multiple topics. I'll let if Ben wants to say anything else as final words, I'll turn it back to him. Otherwise, I'll go back to David.
Yeah, I want to thank again all of the council members for attending, and recognize the work that our staff at the Healthcare Commission have done on this. It's an endeavor of commitment to primary care. Most of this work is done as a hobby, as they all take on work during the day. So these, I know that many of you feel the same way. So we're all in this together. This sense of cooperation and comradeship. Hopefully we can carry it forward. I think we do need to build out more specificity and granularity as we start to put this proposal into something like what CMI is expecting to see in the months ahead. So thank you very much.
So thanks, Ben. Melanie, on the operational side.
Thank you, David. So the notes that are included in this table, a high-level meeting summary and recording from this meeting will be posted to the MHTC website prior to our next meeting. As Dr. Riedman mentioned, we are planning to have a meeting next Tuesday. We will advise, but at this time it's scheduled from 5 to 6:30, and we'll advise everyone if that time changes ahead of time. David, back to you.
Thank you. So I can conclude there. Dr. Riedman, did you have any other final words?
No,
Okay.
Just thanks everybody.
And I would weigh in also to say thank you for everyone who took their time to participate. A great conversation. And it's our pleasure to help move this along in collaboration with everyone here on the virtual call this evening. So with that, we'll say good night and look forward to seeing you all in a week.